I mean, that had to have felt pretty cool.
Yeah, it is hard to imagine that I won an award that Jim Nantz has also won.
Right. Welcome to another edition of the Beautiful Work Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Krikorian. Each episode, we feature a special guest from all walks of life, and we ask them to explore the ins and outs, the ups and downs, the trials and the triumphs of their chosen field. Writers, musicians, coaches, business owners, artists, and everything in between. We peel back the curtain to hear their stories, to walk their paths, to find out how they breathe life into their beautiful work. Thank you all for tuning in to this edition of the Beautiful Work Podcast. Today's guest is Pat Coleman, who has a ton to share about what he does, bringing to the masses all of which is the D3 sports empire for NCAA athletics, football, basketball, baseball, hockey, the whole gamut. Pat has done it for a number of years and is an award-winning journalist and has a ton to say about running a business and pursuing what you love and tons of nuggets of wisdom. And so Pat is a great guest. Can't wait to get to him. Quickly before we do, the last couple of podcasts, I was excited to announce that my new record, Grandeur, which is my 5th record, will be coming out on January the 18th. And we are just really excited. It's not just me. There are many number of people behind this record that have helped bring it to light. And so excited about that release coming up in just over a month after the new year. We will be doing a special Beautiful Work podcast series for the release. So the weeks leading up to the release of the album, I will be interviewing a number of folks that were paramount to bringing this record to light, from the artists, the engineers, the musicians, people with promotion, all about what they do and their careers and how they're bringing the album to light. And so kind of a behind the scenes mini look at the record. And it's fun to interview them and get to hear their stories and what they've meant to the record. So to find out more, please consider joining our newsletter, and you can find it on my website, dankrikorian.com. And you can follow us there. And for those joining for the podcast, welcome. The podcast is going great, and I'm always excited to have new listeners joining in. If you'd like to help the podcast, leaving a rating or comment on iTunes if you're enjoying it is super helpful, or anywhere that you are listening to it. And lastly, if you'd like to support the podcast for a couple of bucks a month, we do have a Patreon page for this podcast, and you can find that on my website, dankrikorian.com as well, or over at Patreon. You can search my name on Patreon and it will bring up the page. Okay, enough bugging you. I can't wait to give you guys Pat Coleman's story. And so without further ado, let's get to the show. Pat Coleman is an award-winning journalist who has dedicated his career to covering collegiate NCAA Division III athletics. Starting as a student radio broadcaster in 1992, Coleman has worked in print and online, while also making multiple television appearances to promote the cause of non-scholarship athletics. Starting with D3Hoops.com in 1997 and expanding to add D3 Football, D3 Baseball, and D3Hockey.com, Coleman has grown the D3 Sports Network into a series of sites covering the NCAA's largest division. In recognition of this growth, The College Sports Information Directors of America gave him the prestigious Jake Wade Award in 2013, where past recipients include the likes of Jim Nantz, Rece Davis, Vern Lundquist, to name a few. He remains the only recipient of the award who does not cover primarily NCAA Division I sports. Coleman spent 12 years at USA Today before joining NBCSports.com in its startup phase. He also hosts a weekly podcast called Around the Nation, where he interviews coaches, athletic directors, players, and talks about the sports and stories from across the nation. He currently resides in Minnesota and is here with us today to talk about building D3Sports.com, a life in journalism, and singing in a choir. I'm here with Pat Coleman. Pat, thanks so much for joining the Beautiful Work, podcast. We're excited to have you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So if it's a Friday or Saturday night and you're not going to a game or you're not watching a game somewhere in America, if you're going to go out and spend some money to see a concert or to watch a band, who are you going to see?
All right. You're going to delve really deeply into some of my geekiness right off the top. So
good.
Great. One of the things that I obviously don't have a lot of spare time between, working as a communications freelancer and doing a bunch of D3 sports websites. I also sing in choirs, and up to 5 of them. So wow. I have really gotten into the choral music scene here in Minnesota. We refer to ourselves kind of tongue in cheek as the land of 10,000 choirs.
Okay.
And there are just so many opportunities to go see, really interesting choral music being performed. Often, I could go see friends of mine perform basically any Friday or Saturday night that I'm not, watching a Division III basketball game or a Division III football game. That is definitely something that I would like to do. I have really kind of been immersed into this only in the last 10 years since I moved back to Minnesota. I grew up here, lived on the East Coast for a long time, then came back here and didn't even realize that this is what I was missing. So I'm having a great amount of fun doing all that. And it basically, it keeps me busy. And that sort of thing. And I've been able to share that with my children who are musicians also. So it's been a whole lot of fun. That is, it's probably, I don't know if you'll get another answer like that in the course of this podcast, but that is what I like to do.
Well, that's great. And that's actually one of the fun things about, people that have been on this podcast is, everybody has sort of this main thing that they do, but then there's also these fun little side projects or other parts of themselves. And I wasn't prepared for you to tell me you were a big choral guy, but that's really great.
Yeah. When I went to college, I wanted to be a high school choir director, so I was a music ed major. Now the education classes out of that study area of study are what really washed me out, but I never lost that love of singing in choir. And I still, even though I'm in my mid 40s, I still would like to be a choir director someday. And I do some of that with my church choir, but I'm not the person in charge by any stretch.
And so what part of the choir are you? An alto, a tenor?
Yeah, I'm a tenor. I'm a first tenor also. So that's the highest male voice part, which also means that, there are a lot of places that a tenor can go sing because tenors are fairly rare. So everybody wants them. Tenors are in demand. You don't have to be great to be in a lot of choirs. And I think that's great for me.
Well, that's good. Well, that's a great answer. And I love the land of 10,000 choirs. That's a great name. Fun fact to start. Now let's dive into a little bit more of what you do on a day-to-day basis. So for those that maybe aren't really in tune with what D3 Sports, D3 Hoops, D3Football.com is, could you maybe talk a little bit about what it is and what you do there?
Sure. And, from an overarching standpoint, the NCAA is subdivided into 3 divisions. Most of the schools that anybody nationally has ever heard of course, are the Division I schools, the large schools like UCLA or, Louisiana State or something like that. But there are, 450 or so schools that are in the division that's known as Division III. And the attraction of Division III for me is that this is the group of schools that does not give scholarships for athletics. So basically, someone who comes and participates in a sport at a Division III school is paying the same regular tuition with whatever financial aid that any other student can get. So they're not getting any special benefits for being on the basketball team or the football team or the baseball team or field hockey or whatever. In fact, often they are, maybe looked down on by their professors, maybe sometimes by their fellow students, because they may think that this person got into the school solely on the basis of their athletic ability, which is really not the way it goes at the Division III level. So the Division III student athletes are really just like everybody else in the school. It's drawn from the student body. You see them in your regular classes. You see them in your lunchroom and in your dorms. They don't have special, dining facilities or that sort of thing. And so I kind of really grew into this at the point in time where people were beginning to be able to publish news and information on the web back in the mid to late 90s. And so it started with a site that was originally called Division III Basketball Online, and then was much better made a much better name out of it, calling it D3Hoops.com about a year into it. Added a site in 1999 called D3Football.com. And now there's a D3Baseball.com site as well, D3Hockey.com for the ice hockey fans up here in my part of the world and out in New England and that sort of thing. And then D3Sports.com is just kind of this umbrella that is, covers the entire network and does also feature stories and scores on the other sports that I didn't just mention, but the ones that are kind of sports specific have what, some semblance of a staff and, do daily coverage of these sports in season. And we really had, at the point that we started this, just kind of tried to be, not the ESPN.com of Division III sports, because we didn't have the video capabilities or the big television network, but, more like if anybody remembers the site, CBS Sportsline, which is what CBS's sports website used to be called back in the late 90s, that was the sort of thing we were trying to do. We were trying to be just a news site that would cover Division III the way the big sites cover Division I. And I like to think we've done as much of that as possible with, very limited resources.
Yeah. And you guys have, it's unbelievable. How much you guys cover daily, in all the different sports. And going back to the inception of, what was D3 Hoops first and then adding all these others, what prompted you to want to start that, to get into covering D3 basketball and then eventually other sports?
I was at a point in college and then shortly after college where I was at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. D.C. is a market that when combined with Baltimore has had all 4 major sports teams, franchises in all the 4 major sports. They had 5 Division I schools. And first as a student and then later as the sports information director at Catholic, really grew to understand not only how little, say, the Washington Post or the local television stations would cover Catholic with all of these other things going on in the market, but that the larger networks paid no attention to Division III whatsoever also. Now, this was like 1994 and 1995, so I didn't really have the ability to do much about that. kind of filed that away, and a couple of years later had the opportunity to actually take over the Division III basketball site that was already being done. D3hoops.com was actually run by somebody else for about a year and a half before I got it. And then in the kind of run up to the fall of 97, I noticed that it wasn't being updated, and wasn't being kind of refreshed for the season. And I contacted the guy, asked if he would be interested in me taking it over. And in my head, it seems like it was like 2 minutes later, I got an email back with an enthusiastic yes and an exclamation point, and then followed immediately by another email with a whole bunch of file attachments and stuff like that. And I figured, it wasn't going to take much to do more and spend more time on the site than the previous guy had, because he'd done a good job in building it. But I really wanted to make it a news site. His was more like a link site, which was, something that people did in the mid 90s. I really wanted to do news because I was a journalist by trade, and I figured it would be a couple hours a night, a couple days a week. That would make it more updated and people would be happy. And then I found all of these sports information directors at Division III schools were interested in sending me information. And there were fans out there of programs all over the place who were really interested in learning what the big picture in NCAA Division III basketball was. And it turned into every night for a couple hours. And then it was like 20 hours a week. And then, after a couple years of it, it was 35 to 40 hours a week. It was a guy with a radio show. It was a daily scoreboard every night that I would cull from the AP wires and surfing conference websites and stuff like that. And it kind of became this when we added football and then added all these other things. This is kind of what it grew into. And it's I couldn't possibly determine or discern the amount of time I've spent on it, and I kind of don't want to know,
Right. And all the stuff that you have just talked about, where it's built to where it is, what do you see your role is in the landscape of Division III athletics? Just like a news site that's promoting games and scores, or did you see growing into something more, or kind of like a voice for D3 sports in general? Like, where do you kind of land within the landscape of athletics?
I definitely feel like we perform that function, the form or the function of being the champion for NCAA Division III sports. We did that kind of alone for about 18 years or so. The NCAA did not really do a very good job of this up until about a couple of years ago, when they really embraced social media and that sort of thing, probably about 2 or 3 years ago at the NCAA level. The folks who are, not to get too deep into how the NCAA works, but there are a handful of people who work solely on Division III issues, and same with Division II. But like everybody else is responsible for all the things that happen at the NCAA at the NCAA at all levels, and subsequently, people those people don't have a lot of attention to give to Division III, so it kind of just got left on the wayside. I felt like we did that really well for a long time, was be the voice of what's good in Division III. But like I said, I'm a journalist, and we cover everything, even if it's not good news, so to speak. We definitely do a lot of PR for NCAA Division III and for NCAA Division III schools. But, if there's something that's going wrong or bad news, we have to cover that too. And sometimes that's not necessarily fun for me or fun for my team. But, in order to be a legitimate news site, those are the things we have to do. And we haven't forgotten that.
Sure. What does a typical day look like for you working on the site?
Oh, gosh. Well, if we start in the morning, and let's for the moment pretend that I don't have a day job.
Okay.
So we'll forget about that for a second. We'll start in the morning by reviewing whatever's coming on social media overnight, or email, or that sort of thing. It kind of depends on what sport is in season too. Basketball, there are games basically every night, so there's always some maintenance that has to be done to make sure that all the scores got in, either get all the scores in before I get a chance to go to sleep, or come back and double back in the morning and make sure that last night's scores all got in somehow. Like I said, check what people are saying at us on social media or saying about Division III basketball or about Division III football. On a more weekly basis, we're assigning out feature stories and columns. We have a team of about 3 or 4 writers on D3 football, and it will be about the same on D3 hoops this season. So we're signing out columns on a weekly basis for those people. And then, later in the week, we're receiving those columns and editing them and, finding photos and putting, the layout together and putting them on the website. So on D3 football, we now do 2 podcasts a week. The second one is new for us this year. So there are 2 days where I'm recording and editing a podcast. There's another at one portion of the day where I'm looking for a relatively long form guest interview that's going to be about 10 to 12 minutes. And gosh, I know the sorts of, we have a message board, of course, also, which is, forums are not really the wave of the present. They're probably the wave of 10 to 12 years ago, but there's still a very active community on our message board on d3boards.com. And I like to read those posts. The nice thing is that the community has kind of self-policed itself over the course of the last 10 years or so. So I don't have to actively be a moderator. I can kind of just, enjoy it and participate in it and read what people have to say and get story ideas from it. It is it can be an all-encompassing process. And that didn't even account for, say, a football game day on Saturday, where a typical weekend in Division III football, you might have 120 games going on a Saturday. So typically me, although also other members of my team and I are then going through all of those things and figuring out what the big storylines are and what the stories, what the key games are for the day, and, compiling all that into a summary. And then that spins off into a column and then off into a podcast. And it's the great thing is that I really enjoyed being a journalist back when being a journalist was something that you could do for a living, right? Mm-hmm. So this allows me to still do that. It allows me to manage a team and direct our editorial coverage for football and basketball. And then for like the baseball and hockey sites, they have someone like me who's doing the day-to-day stuff. And I'm just more providing logistical support and kind of grand editorial direction for the network as a whole.
Wow. It's a lot of stuff that you're doing.
I give very long answers. I'm sorry. I hope but that's all right.
It's totally fine. It's encouraged. And I think that it's just good to know. I think, when you look at a website, people don't often realize just how much work goes into it. And I've actually myself just been very curious as to, how you're able to get so much content and get all those stories and the rankings and the boards. And you said it, it's a 35, 40-hour week thing. And I can 100% imagine that being easily the case, especially football, basketball season where there's so many games going on all the time.
Yeah. And I don't mean to gloss over the fact that I do have other members on my on a team that help out. So guys like Keith McMillan and Adam Turr are very, integral into making sure that the football site runs. And Gordon Mann just ran d3hoops.com for me in my absence for 2 years. And Dave McHugh and Ryan Scott helped with the Division III basketball coverage as well. And also all of the sports information directors across the country. There's someone who's the SID is basically like the PR person for the athletic department. And so they are also providing us information, or in some cases providing information into a network that we draw out of, kind of like an Associated Press type relationship.
Okay. Do you find that Division III sports is different in certain parts of the country?
Oh, definitely. I think, first of all, there's a couple of parts of the country where Division III is relatively unknown and relatively new. There weren't a lot of D3 schools in Texas up until about 15 years ago, 20 years ago now. It's in the South Atlantic, like in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. There were no Division III schools up until even more recently, like 10 years ago. The Pacific Northwest has a small pocket. Southern California has a small pocket, and then there's one Division III school in the entirety of the Mountain Time Zone. There's no Division III in either Dakota. There's no Division III in South Carolina or Florida. So there are lots of places where Division III is just absent, just first of all, from that standpoint. And then, there are places where Division III is like a hotbed, like New England. You think about how small New England is on a geographic scale, but there are about 80 schools up there, kind of starting from Fairfield County in Connecticut on the border of New York, and then up through Maine. There's about 80 schools in that relatively small space. So you kind of can't go anywhere without stumbling over a Division III school, and it's known, and the brand, as it were, of Division III or of Division III schools is kind of understood there, where in other parts of the country it's definitely not.
And it's an interesting question, because I know for basketball we're kind of at Chapman, and we're out here on an island, us in the Northwest Conference, as far as just like you said, geographically there's nothing between us and then we get to Colorado and Texas, and we go back east to play sometimes, and I know it's D3 basketball, and I know football too, as well, is just looked at differently, I think. Especially the East Coast, like you mentioned as well. And so in your times traveling around, have you called or been to games in certain areas that you feel like maybe even fan base wise has a different type of support?
I think so. I think where Division III schools thrive are where they are, if not the only game in town, they're at least the big game in town. Very early on when I was doing this, for the first time back in the late 90s, I was learning about what it was like in the CCIW, which is the College Conference of Illinois and Wisconsin. Schools in Chicago area, but also Illinois Wesleyan in Bloomington, Illinois is not the largest school in Bloomington or in the Bloomington Normal metro area. Illinois State is a D1 school that's there, but Illinois Wesleyan gets a huge amount of coverage, and they get a tremendous amount of local fan support for basketball, for example. I mean, 2,300 fans doesn't sound like a lot, but at the Division III level, that's pretty big. Holland, Michigan, Western Michigan, where Hope College is and where Calvin College is, and Kalamazoo and that sort of thing. That's also a place where there's not a lot of other high level collegiate sports for people to follow, not a lot of pro sports. So Division III has an opportunity to thrive there. Those are the places. And then, spots in Ohio also, Division III does really well. Some places in Minnesota where I'm living right now, Division III does really well in terms of, especially in football. It's one of this area is one of the highest drawing attendances in the conference. It's local here. So there are definitely spots where Division III is more popular and people come and watch it, aside from just the people who are the students or the parents or the alumni of the schools, where it does draw a local fan base. And that's where the difference is. If you're in a place where you can draw your local people who live in your town out to a game, then you're really going to have that kind of separator in terms of fan support.
Sure. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. I know sometimes we've talked about that, almost sometimes to the detriment. We're located, right by the beach, right by the, LA, the Lakers, and there's a million things that people can be doing on a Friday, Saturday night. And so we're not the small town draw, like you said, and it's really interesting. And we do actually have a great following as well. But, 2 years ago, we were in the NCAA tournament playing up at Whitman, and, Whitman in a small town, Walla Walla, up there, middle of not a lot of stuff up there in Washington. And it felt like the entire town was in the gym when we played the game. And it was really cool, just a really, really cool environment. But I know they do really well for that kind of same instance that you talked about, where, Whitman basketball has been great the last few years, and they're the best thing to see on a Friday, Saturday night in town. So interesting dynamic. And kind of going off of that, in your years of covering different Division III schools and programs. And I think, answer this however you want with football, basketball, baseball, hockey. But are there certain schools that kind of structurally set themselves apart as a program? And is that because of, academic reputation, the tuition costs, the facilities, the location, some of the big time programs? Is there something that you've seen across the board that really helps them deliver a high quality program year in, year out?
I think that the most important thing is just an institutional commitment to the value that athletics brings a Division III institution. And the nice thing, I guess, about that is that it kind of varies from school to school, or from, type of school to type of school. For example, there are a lot of places where one of the main focuses of athletics is just to bring students into the school and, fill classrooms and fill rooms in dorms and that sort of thing, where, you may have a school that has, let's say, 1,500 undergraduates or something like that. And, up to a quarter or a third of them could be participating in intercollegiate athletics. And that's a really big part of the campus experience, I think. And it's important to those schools then that their athletic department is supported, and that they're capable of being successful. And, obviously the definition of success can vary all over the place. So that's kind of one set of school where, a commitment to athletics is manifested in that sense. Now, there's other schools, like there are a bunch of state schools in Division III as well. Division III is made up of about 25% state institutions, public institutions. They are often, they can be larger. There are some that are, for all of the attention that at the Division III level, and it's going to get kind of D3 geeky and nuts and bolts here for a second, but
it's okay.
There's a lot of attention paid to, for example, the Wisconsin Intercollegiate Athletic Conference, which is 8 state schools in Wisconsin. And there's been a lot of success, maybe not in the last 10 years, but before that, from state schools in New Jersey. Rowan, for example, William Patterson, Richard Stockton, the College of New Jersey, that sort of thing, kind of across sports. But there are also places where there are state schools in Massachusetts that do not produce, deep national championship runs, that sort of thing, where Division III is, and athletics are kind of an afterthought. They're not something that the institution spends a lot of time or energy focusing on. Similarly, state schools in New York, a bunch of state schools in New York that kind of run the gamut. Some get big support and some do well and some don't. And it really is, at those schools, of course, you're not really looking for someone to a football program to have 120 kids and, add 120 kids to your enrollment, because your enrollment is going to be like 5,000 or 6,000 already. So that's not necessarily the big driver for athletic success that it might be somewhere else. Those schools, though, also, of course, have advantages in the fact that, the tuition is lower. Some schools, not all schools, but some schools at the state level are easier to get into. Some are pretty exclusive, though. So that's not really that's not a blanket, statement that you can make about all state schools at the Division III level. And some support athletics really well, and some actually are also kind of like schools that we've already talked about, in that they're in small towns and they're the big game in town, like University of Wisconsin Whitewater or UW Stevens Point, or UW Oshkosh, where there aren't other schools. They're the big school for their area. And so if UW Stevens Point has a basketball arena that seats 2,400, then they might put 19 to 2,100 in there on 14 nights from, November to March. Mm-hmm. And that's a great thing for the community, because it's something for the community to do. It's great for the university. It's great for the athletic department. It's great for the student athletes. I really enjoy going and seeing games that are in packed houses, whether that is a gym that seats 500 or a gym that seats 2,400 or 2,800. It's just a lot of fun. It's great for the atmosphere. So I like that we have this wide range of experiences in Division III. And the nice thing is that as much as people kind of decry the success that state schools have at the expense of private schools at the Division III level, in all actuality, there are 25%, like I said, of the programs at the D3 level are state schools, and they generally win about 25% of the national championships. So It's not like there is some outsized share of the championships going to state schools. Like everything, it kind of varies from year to year, but I've been tracking it for about the last, back into the last 20 years or so. And the state schools have never won more than about 28 or 29% of the championships in any given year. So it's been, there have been some high profile runs by state schools in football, and some years where the state schools in men's basketball do well, but as a whole, it's not really any different. It just kind of bears out the general demographics of the split between public and private.
Okay. What do you feel about the decision to move the Stag Bowl from Salem after 25 years?
Nice. Right. Well, I was not particularly happy when it first happened, when they first talked about it, when they first told us about that it was happening. And we got a heads up of about 24 hours to work on the story before the NCAA published it.
And I'm sorry, for those that don't know what the Stag Bowl is, it's basically the Super Bowl of Division III football.
Yeah,
correct.
It is the championship game for Division III football. Yes, sorry, I should have clarified that too.
No, I should have said it, but go ahead.
So, it was definitely a shock to us. And then also, at the same time, in the exact same announcement, everybody learns that they moved the men's basketball Final Four out of Salem, Virginia as well. Salem is this little town outside of Roanoke. Roanoke, Virginia is the quote unquote big town in that area. And, I don't know where they rank right now in terms of, what media market it is. That's usually the number that I look at in terms of trying to determine how big a metro area is, but it's somewhere deep in the triple digits. Roanoke, Virginia has its own, has a daily newspaper and all the network affiliates, but it's not a very large area. And Salem is a neighboring town. But Salem took the Stag Bowl when nobody wanted it back in the early 1990s. It had been in Alabama for a while, and it had done well in Alabama, and then it moved away, and then it went back to Alabama, and it flopped, and then it went to Bradenton, Florida, and it did not do well there either. And nobody wanted it. It was to the point where it might not be a neutral site championship anymore because nobody wanted to host it. And Salem, Virginia, and the commissioner of the Division III conference, the Old Dominion Athletic Conference that's in that area, put together a bid for it. They got it. They turned Division III championships into something that people wanted, and they turned the Stag Bowl into something that people wanted. Like over the course of the 25 years, they took what was basically this small city stadium in a relatively small town of Virginia, and they upgraded it as much as the city budget could allow. They did all the things that you have to do. They upgraded the locker rooms. They put in turf. They created a whole atmosphere around the game, which involved the locals and that sort of thing. And they had a tremendous following and support in terms of volunteers in the area. And that is the thing that makes, I think, any championship, really not just a Division III national championship, but any championship, you need to have these people who are going to help you out with, your logistical stuff. And they act as host families for the schools, for the teams that participate, make sure that they have somewhere to do their laundry or do their laundry for them, all sorts of, stuff that you kind of can do for yourself when you're at home, but you can't do when you're traveling. Right. So that's what Salem brought to the Division III level. And they added things to championships that then became part of the standard package for everybody else. Division III's relationship with Special Olympics, for example, was something that was created in Salem and now is part of every Division III national championship. It is, I really feel that neither the basketball folks nor the football folks realized that the other group was also going to take their championship out at the same time. I think that the NCAA people feel badly about that they would have liked to leave one of them there. But so to get back to how I feel about it now, I've actually spent some time this summer visiting some of the new championship sites. So I have not been down to suburban Houston, where the football championship will be for the next 2 years, but I spent some time in Canton, Ohio, to see what the plans for 2020 and 2021 look like. And I think that's going to be a great experience for the student athletes, because the Pro Football Hall of Fame is right there. They have an amazing stadium that's probably too big for Division III, but still, if they put anywhere near, if they put 9,000 people in a stadium that seats 25 for the NFL preseason game and seats like 14 or so the rest of the time, I think that's going to be a great atmosphere. I visited Fort Wayne, Indiana, where the men's basketball Final Four is going to go for the next 4 years. Mm-hmm. I think that building is going to be great. I think they have some really cool plans, and I look forward to seeing what that looks like. Baseball is moving from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Actually Appleton, Wisconsin, where it's been for the last 16 or so years, and it's moving to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And I spent some time down there this summer to chat with the folks who are hosting it. And I really feel like all three of those championships are in a position where now we're going to have some new blood and some new ideas, and it could be really cool for the student athlete. And that is what the NCAA cares most about. Even at the national championship, the fan experience is not the most important thing. It's really the experience for the student athlete. And I'm looking forward now. I have some optimism about all three of those sites to see what they will do once they're given a chance to host their championship.
Yeah, I know it was a little bit of a shock when both football and basketball announced.
Yeah,
they were both leaving Salem. Just from what I read and everything I'd heard about Salem, it was just such a great place, and the people there did such a good job hosting the event. So I know Salem has talked about potentially putting in a bid for football to come back sometime down the line. So I guess we'll see if that's the case. But you yourself, this will be the 19th season or 20th season that you've broadcasted the Stag Bowl game. Is that correct?
Let's see. 2018 will be the 20th. Yeah, it'll be number 20. So it'll be a new experience for us, new place too. So, but it's been fun, and I like to broadcast too. Sometimes now it's the only football game I get to broadcast all year is this championship game, but it's something that I still love to do.
How do you prepare for that? What do you do behind the scenes to broadcast a big time game like that?
So we'll just talk about like national championship type games, or games that are late in the playoffs where you've got teams participating at a high level, and teams that you've been following them for 14 weeks, 15 weeks, something like that. So I'll come in with a base knowledge of what these schools are and what the programs are, so I don't have to spend a lot of time studying the big picture, right? All I do is the big picture 365 days a year. And the nice thing in football, for example, has been really nice to us over the last 20 years in that they have not really presented us with a lot of different schools at the championship level, right?
Right.
Mount Union has been there, oh gosh, I would say 18 times, 17 times in the 19 that I've done so far. Wisconsin Whitewater has been there 7 or 8 times, 8 times maybe. So I haven't had to do a lot of new memorization of names, which is nice. But like at the championship level, it is not just, of course, about the game itself, or the 3.5 hours that a football game is on, or the 2 hours that a basketball game is on. It is, I mean, you mentioned it already. You used the term that it's the Super Bowl for Division III football, and that's how we treat it. We are fortunate to have had people who live in and around around Salem, within a 5 or 6 hour drive, so we can get as many of our people there as possible. We do like a 2 hour pregame show. The last couple of years, we've had live video from the field. The Salem folks actually put together for us a platform out the back of the end zone. So we have a pregame show that is right there on the field with the teams warming up in the background and stuff like that. That's been fantastic. Now we do our post-game podcast at we've done it at a local pizza place after the game, and that's been a lot of fun because we've done it. That's the only live podcasting we'll do all year is that. And people are in town for the game, and, so they don't mind people talking about the Stag Bowl while they're trying to eat their pizza or have their post-game beer or whatever. And we don't mind talking about football while we're having our post-game pizza or beer or whatever. So that's good. And then, it's also the time where we get to meet with coaches, because often this is a place where Division III coaches congregate at the end of the season. So there has been probably for 10 years running or so, a subset of the NABC, the National Association of Basketball Coaches, Division III members come to Salem and have meetings and network and that sort of thing. So there's probably about 40 coaches at the D3 men's Final Four. And we get to do a lot of our networking and that sort of thing there. Dave McHugh, who I mentioned before, who works with the Hoop site, has hosted a reception for coaches because he does a radio show, so to speak, or a internet show about Division III basketball. There's just a lot of things that are going on aside from those few hours where the game is taking place, and we really try to maximize it. We're there for 5 days, 4 nights maybe for football when there's just one game that's being played. We've hosted the broadcast of what is essentially the Division III Heisman the last 8 years or so. So we have a crew of people who put together, set up all the camera work and stuff, and Dave does production for that. We have a guy who hosts our live stream. I'm not the guy who even hosts our live stream, because I'm the guy who is the Chris Fowler role, basically. I'm the guy who's asking each of the 4 questions on stage as part of the ceremony before they then reveal who the big winner is. So that's a whole production too. But that's one of the nice things about having been involved in Division III for so long, is that those opportunities to do really cool stuff that's cool for the student athletes, but is also cool for us, professionally and personally. It's just fun to be involved in stuff like that. And that, having done this for so long, kind of has made some of those opportunities happen.
When I was a kid, one of my first dreams was to be a great sports writer. I became the sports editor at my high school newspaper. My dad bought me, and I read every article I could by greats like Jim Murray. In fact, my first semester in college, I was a journalism major. Though I eventually moved in a different direction, I've always appreciated what folks like Pat Coleman do. Now a college basketball coach at a Division III school, the value that Pat Coleman provides for programs like ours is immeasurable. And Pat has become much more than just a journalist for D3 athletics. He is a connector of people, schools, conferences, ideas, and stories from around the nation on a weekly basis. In a division that doesn't frequently receive national attention, but has some of the most loyal students and fans throughout many parts of the country, Pat is a champion for these student athletes who will undoubtedly become our next CEOs, doctors, lawyers, business owners, and beyond. After over 20 years of building the D3 Sports brand, Pat seems to breathe life into it as vigorously as ever. And if you listen to Pat's podcast, it's filled with the same type of vision, understanding, and humor that great journalists seem to possess. And speaking of sports humor, to end with a quote from the great Jim Murray, "Show me a man who is a good loser, and I'll show you a man who's playing golf with his boss." And another one of those things that you produce and that you're a big part of is the, you mentioned it a couple times, but the Around the Nation podcast. And I believe it's the 12th season that your podcast has been around, and something that you do, like you said earlier, I think you do it twice a week, if I'm correct, during football season. And what has that podcast done to, I guess, the brand of D3 football? Has it really helped grow? Do you have a good listener base that kind of tunes in every podcast, or how does that help with what you do?
It's been really interesting. My co-host on the podcast, Keith McMillan, and the guy who's been kind of my right-hand man since like December of '99 on football, likes to say that we had a podcast before podcasting was cool. We started in like September of 2007. I'm not sure I really knew what a podcast was in December of 2007. I'm fairly certain I didn't come up with the idea initially to say we should have a podcast, but we all came from, a background where we broadcast games and, or hosted radio shows or that sort of thing. So in that sense, it wasn't all that different. We just would not be able to find a place that would host a Division III football radio show. So this podcasting thing took care of that for us. Just like you wouldn't find a place that would do national news coverage of Division III basketball or have a Division III basketball and football top 25 poll. So we did that ourselves, right? I didn't, even though, like you said, this is the 12th season of it, and we've done 208 episodes of this thing, as far as I can tell. It really wasn't until the last 3 years or so that it kind of became what it is. As I started listening to more podcasts myself, podcasting is popular. I don't know if you've noticed. So, I've listened.
Yes.
Right. I've listened to a lot more. I've listened to a couple of podcasts that are on the Maximum Fun Network. And those guys do some great production and post-production work to try to liven up those podcasts. Keith and I were literally talking last night, and I was kind of, as we do the podcast, sometimes I'm making notes as we go as to where I'm going to drop in stuff, sound effects or music beds or that sort of thing. Every once in a while, I write a bit or a story that is that has one of those in mind, right? That sort of thing. And I was kind of walking through some of that stuff with Keith after we finished recording last night, and he said, basically any time where the listener gets to hear something else other than our voices, he thinks that's good. I think that's good. So that's nice. Nobody has yet complained to us that we put too many bells and whistles or sound effects or whatever into the podcast. So I guess we have that going.
No, it's good. I love it.
The sad thing about our podcast is that, since we've been doing it for so long, we've always done it self-hosted. We have not had great access to analytics. So we did not have a really good way to get download numbers from the first 9 seasons. So I don't really know what the trend in terms of growth. I do know that I'm pretty happy with the download numbers that we've had over the last year or so. We try to push it pretty hard. We know that not everybody's interested in listening to a podcast. Not everybody's interested in listening to us for, now it's 45 minutes since we do it twice a week. So that's good. It used to be, if we were doing it once a week, we were trying to cram everything in. It would be more like an hour and 15 minutes on a Monday. And I could understand where that would be difficult to just drop that on a listener and expect them to listen to the whole thing, for 15 weeks in a row. I get that. So I'm hopeful that having two smaller chunks that end up being more content, because it's going to be an hour and 40 minutes of content spread over two podcasts. I'm hopeful that continues to do well. We do notice so far, and we're only like 5 weeks into doing the 2 podcast a week thing. We do notice that we get, we're not just like splitting our former weekly numbers over two podcasts. It's not quite that everybody listens to both of them, but it seems like we're reaching more people, or at least we're getting more total downloads this way. And how else do you measure a podcast? If you know some other way of measuring a podcast, please let me know.
I will, but it sounds like it's doing well. And it's just another feature of your whole site. That's another access point for people that are interested in D3 sports. And, I'm obviously have this podcast of my own, but I'm a huge podcast listener. And, I, especially during basketball season, love tuning into different podcasts, and it's something that's easy when you're driving into work.
Yeah. To
get some news and to hear some stories. And so, I think it's great. And, I listened to the one that you guys just put out and then the one from a week before. And, I love the bells and whistles that you guys put in. So keep doing it. It's fun.
The nice thing is that, doing the podcast is personally enjoyable for us. So that's good. It's also helpful that it seems to, like you said, extend the brand of d3football.com, but it's also fun, and we don't always get to do a lot of things that are fun. So it's nice to be able to do it. You're
obviously someone that's very passionate about D3 sports and just sports media in general, and have been doing it for a long time. And in 2013, you got the Jake Wade Award, which is an outstanding contribution in the media to the field of intercollegiate athletics. And a couple of, a lot of great names. 2018, Jim Nantz. 16, Rece Davis. 2015, Vern Lundquist. Yourself in 2013. Pretty cool award for you, I'm sure. And could you describe a little bit about what that was like to receive that?
Yeah, it is hard to imagine that I won an award that Jim Nantz has also won, and I won it before. It just doesn't seem right, It was really. This is so cliche, and I really hate using cliches, but it was in a sense just an honor to be nominated or to be considered for it, because it did a couple of things. One, it brought more notice to what we do, and like I said, not just me, but everything that the whole team here over at d3sports.com does. But also, it signified to me that the Division III sports information directors kind of won a battle with the larger organization, the COSIDA, which is the College Sports Information Directors of America. Nobody had ever won this award who covered anything other than NCAA Division I sports. I know from having, known SIDs for a quarter of a century and having been one myself, that the, Division III schools just aren't given a lot of attention in that organization. It's a large organization. Division I schools have probably 4 or 5 or 6 members of COSIDA on their staff, and someone like Chapman would be fortunate to have 2. And in a lot of places at Division III, there's just one SID trying to cover 21 sports. So, they get outvoted in a lot of things, is what I'm trying to say. They make up a fairly small part of the organization and get a small amount of the organization's attention. So for them to have been able to make this possible was just amazing to me in the first place. It has, I can't say it's really changed what I do. It hasn't brought me a lot of notoriety. I think people look at the list and go, oh, Robin Roberts. I've never heard of this guy, that sort of thing. Right. But it was nice to have that validation, right? For having at that point done it for 15 years or so, and have something resembling national notoriety for it. That really made me feel good, gave me a lot of energy at a time where I was kind of flagging a little bit, trying to do all of this from August 1st or so until April 1st. I'm basically I would be working 2 full-time jobs, and it would burn me out by the time basketball rolled around, and I would have to really get some kind of jolt of adrenaline from December and January basketball games in order to have enough energy to get through the rest of the season. So that definitely gave me a little energy boost for a couple years. That was really nice to have.
Well deserved, and congrats on that. And yeah, it is probably fun looking at that list and seeing all those big time people and have yourself rightfully included in there. Okay, what's one of the best investments you've made in your career?
I think that just investing the time to get to know people and to also learn my craft. I worked at USA Today kind of basically from almost right out of college up until about 2006. I spent 12 years in that organization, but I started out, as a 22-year-old kid or something like that, thinking that, my experience as a student broadcaster and as a student newspaper guy made me qualified to work at USA Today. It really didn't. I learned so much just by being in a professional newsroom environment, watching what, like the veteran copy editors would do, what a layout person would do, I learned how to do Photoshop by sitting next to the guy on staff who did Photoshop. I learned about writing from watching and editing some of the great copy that we would get. It is definitely been more of an investment of time than an investment of money to make D3sports.com run. The entirety of the 6 or 7 websites that we do runs on basically about $80,000 a year. That's the entire budget for everything. So that's hosting of the website, that's travel, that's paying people who provide content, that sort of thing. Actually, those are probably just the big buckets right there, or those handful of things. Because we don't, so you can understand that doesn't leave a salary for me, right? That doesn't leave a whole lot of money. D3sports.com pays for the internet to our house and my cell phone on a monthly basis. And then otherwise it's just covering costs for like travel and accommodations and everything. So it's really been a gigantic investment of time, but it has been so worth it. It has been so much fun to do this for, it's more than 20 years. For coming up on 21 years from when I first started doing D3hoops.com. And that has been, it has been invested in, like I said, learning how to be a journalist, learning how to relate to people. That's something that you don't necessarily know how to do in a professional environment right out of college sometimes. And then just, learning who the people are and what the stories are in Division III. And then, having to relearn it every couple of years because the environment constantly changes. I've certainly invested a lot of my own money in making this happen and getting this started, but I've invested way more time. Like I said earlier in the podcast, I couldn't try to imagine how much time, and I don't want to know. It's been years of my life working on Division III sports and D3sports.com.
Yeah, and that's a great answer. And it's kind of a tough question, I know, and most of the, if not all of the other guests that have been on this podcast have had some semblance of that answer that you have, where it's investment in people and relationships and people that help you grow, and then also just time to the craft that they say, which I think is interesting because it spans all different types of careers that have been on this podcast: musicians, coaches, athletes, business owners. And so I thought your answer was spot on for sure.
I appreciate that.
Do you have a book or books that you would recommend or give as a gift to someone?
Wow. Man, I am now trying to turn around to see what's on my bookshelf. It has been a long time since I've put anything on my... that's a good question. Even if I don't know about that necessarily, I don't get a chance to read a lot of books. I spend a lot of my time reading content about Division III or, like I said, way back at the beginning, singing in a choir of some sort. I'd say that there's a couple of books that one that I'm currently reading and one that I recommend to a number of people. And the one that I'm currently reading, I'll start with first, is a story about the USFL. It's a book about the USFL. It's written by Jeff Pearlman. It's called Football for a Buck. The sudden rise and rapid demise of the USFL, I think is the subtitle, something like that.
Okay.
It has been just, for someone who was young in the 80s and of a really formative sports age, like I was 12, 13, 14 years old when that league was in play. It has just been a fantastic read for me. I'm not quite finished with it yet, but it has been so much fun to read about all of the kind of neat and interesting stories behind the USFL. Pearlman is a guy who worked at Sports Illustrated, has written several books, and this one is clearly a labor of love for him. And I've really enjoyed reading it, kind of just based on that. It's been it's just been a fun read. I would definitely recommend that to people. It just came out the second week of September, so I would definitely recommend that to people. It is new and it is out there and it's a lot of fun.
Okay, perfect. That sounds good. It sounds super interesting as that whole USFL thing. It's just an interesting topic in general. So thank you for that recommendation. Hey, this has been really, really great. I've learned so much about just the D3 behind the scenes working. And I know that listeners of this podcast will really benefit from it. And hopefully we get some new fans out there in the seats watching these D3 athletic events. Before we end today, I just want to say thanks again, and then I'm going to leave you with the last word, Pat. So anything that you want to add as we close out the interview?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate you inviting me on the podcast, especially when you talked about the other people who have been on, and people will see interviews with other people in the feed. To be included on that list is really special for me. So I appreciate that. I think what I would recommend for people to do is just go seek out your local small college. Hopefully it's one at the NCAA Division III level, but there's lots of places outside, the big 64 or even the big 300 schools that are in Division I, where there are kids, young people who are participating in athletics and doing it for the love of the game, not for an opportunity to get a pro contract or get a free college education. So that means that in a lot of cases, the contests that are taking place at the NCAA Division III level, there may be, men or women who are a couple of inches shorter, a little bit slower, that sort of thing. You might not have as many dunks or, as many big blow up hits in the backfield or something like that. It might not be, this super mega athletic event that you might expect, but it's great fundamental basketball. It's great fundamental football, great fundamental baseball, soccer, etc. And the nice thing is that, you don't have to pay a bunch of money to go to these events. In a lot of cases, in fact, admission is free, but if not, it's usually a really reasonable rate. You don't have to spend, $20 on parking and then, walk a mile to the game and spend $8 on a hot dog when you get there, something like that. It's fan friendly, it's family friendly, it's accessible, and it's a lot of fun. And to me, that is what I think of the draw. What I think the draw is for NCAA Division III sports for the general sports fan, or even someone who just has a young family and wants to find some cheap entertainment on a Friday night or on a Saturday afternoon. There's going to be a college somewhere for you that you can go take your kids to an event, and I would definitely encourage that people do so.
Well, thank you, Pat, so much, and we will be on the lookout for your podcast and all that stuff coming up next. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate
it. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Beautiful Work Podcast featuring Pat Coleman. Please follow Pat at d3sports.com. Basketball, baseball, football, hockey, and more from around the nation for Division III athletics, as well as his weekly podcast called Around the Nation. Thank you to Jack Carlino for providing the artwork for the episode. The two songs that you heard on the episode, the one right now and the one during the interludes, those are new songs coming out on the new record Grandeur, January the 18th. Please follow us or subscribe to our newsletter at dankrikorian.com. And as always, whatever you're doing, wherever you are, keep making that beautiful work. We'll see you next time.